welcome to this session on clean growth in a global gateway. How can the South East lead the shift to low carbon transport and trade? Some of you who are familiar with Transport for the South East might have been expecting my colleague Lucy to be facilitating the session, but she's unwell today, so I'm stepping in. So I am Jasmine Barnacote and I'm a project manager for Transport for the South East. And today we're joined by a really good panel of speakers. So we've got Tanya Ferry, Head of Environment, Port of London Authority, Mark Taylor, Acting Chief Executive Officer of Freeport East, Dr. Conor Walsh, Environmental Scientist from the University of Greenwich, and I believe is also working with Carbonate, and Robert Edge from Haven Gateway for the TALE project. So just to confirm, and you all should be really familiar with it by now, but you feel free to ask questions. We'll have sort of an opportunity for questions towards the end of the session. If you use the chat function, the chat button at the bottom of your page, and to submit your questions. I'll now ask each speaker to introduce themselves properly and also kind of tell us a little bit about their organisations and their experience. So I will start off with Tanya, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you, Jasmine. Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me well enough. There is a noisy meeting next door. If you hear any background noise, I do apologise. It's one of these functions of Teams, isn't it? So as Jasmine has introduced me, I am the Head of Environment for the Port of London Authority. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are a trust port that manage and conserve the tidal Thames for trade within. We don't actually necessarily manage cargo in the same way as some of the other ports you might be familiar with do. We use the river to facilitate that trade and see it as a low carbon route to bring trade from the east into the centre of London. We are the UK's largest port. We're still at the top at the moment, so we're happy to continue that and bring that mantle to the southeast. We, as an organisation of 300 people, have set ourselves our own net zero carbon reduction by 2040 with a minimum amount of offset as much as we can, but we want to make sure those offset benefits are actually invested in the natural based solutions that we can do in the estuary itself as much as we're able to. We recently done some analysis on the trade that is likely to occur in the future, and how maritime solutions may also change in terms of power and fuels in future carbon reduction scenarios. We did the analysis on the trade using the Climate Change Committee, and being a port that carries a lot of fuels, there is a need to look at how we might replace that trade in a sustainable growth and green growth. So this kind of discussion today is right on the focus of the PLA and the future of the Thames. We very recently started a refresh on the Thames Vision, which is a strategic plan, and that is looking at how we can reduce emissions from all organisations across the Thames. And we very recently had an award from DFT to investigate some of those more tangly alternative fuels in terms of the safety responsibilities that we have as an organisation, but also in terms of collaboration with the likes of the Greater London Authority, where we know hydrogen in all forms is likely to need to be appearing on the river for both international shipping and for inland vessels, and now we need to make that option safe and make sure that those operators have certainty about what solutions they may need to put in their vessels in future, while working with the boroughs on the basis of the safety that may need in that process. That was all I was going to say for an introduction. Hopefully that's covered what was needed, and I look for some questions later.
Thank you. So if I hand over to Mark Taylor to have his introduction.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Taylor. I'm an executive member of Huddersfield Ports. In the UK, we own and operate 3 ports, which is the Port of Felixstowe, Harwich International, and where I'm speaking from here today, which is in London Thames Port on the River Medway. With the sun coming through the window, we could do with some more solar in Thamesport at the moment to take advantage of those rays. One of my other roles, however, is privileged to be the acting Chief Executive of Freeport East, which is one of 8 free ports awarded by the government and announced in the spring budget. Freeport East is centred around the ports of Felixstowe and Harwich, and we also have a site at Stowmarket called Gateway 14. Combined, Freeport East is offering 275 hectares of investment opportunity for inward investors in UK businesses to expand and take advantage of the many Freeport benefits that are on offer, both from a tax perspective, but also simplified customs procedures. Where does this fit in with net zero? Net zero for our Freeport is front and centre on what we are looking to achieve. Within our Freeport opportunity, particularly in the southeast and in Harwich, and working closely with CELOP, we have an opportunity to develop 122 hectares of what we're looking to focus as being a green energy hub, particularly with its location being very, very close to the offshore wind market, also equidistance to nuclear at Sizewell and at Bradwell, also with solar nearby as well. There is a huge opportunity for us to create a transitional space to enter the market to serve what is going to be a huge growth in demand in creation of green energy. And then in addition, our Freeport has that opportunity also to utilise some of that green energy, because the port of Felixstowe, for those who are not aware, is the largest container port in the UK by some distance, twice as big as its nearest competitors, and is a major UK hub for UK transport, intermodal transport, in the fact that we are receiving 6,000 trucks per day. We receive 38 trains a day in and out, plus the vessels, plus the on-port equipment. And Hutchinson Ports as a group is going through a decarbonisation agenda as well. So Freeport East is a huge opportunity for our region, huge opportunity for UK PLC, and we will do our level best in terms of moving at pace in the net zero agenda. That's it for me, Jasmine. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll hand over now to Dr. Conor Walsh.
Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be involved. Thank you very much. My name's Conor, and I'm an environmental scientist based at the Natural Resources Institute in the University of Greenwich. Now, this is an interdisciplinary research institute that is mainly focused around trying to integrate the aims of the Sustainable Development Goals and a sustainable future within the paradigm of making food systems across the world more equitable and climate smart and sustainable all around. However, my interest in this particular element focuses from a previous incarnation where I was involved in research on marine decarbonisation for about 8 years. So I was involved in a large-scale consortium work with a number of other institutes involved trying to develop scenarios for the decarbonisation of global trade in terms of supply and demand of different materials and how that is satisfied by different segments of the global fleet and the technological and infrastructural needs for credible decarbonisation pathways for those, and involved in detailed lifecycle assessment work of the greenhouse gases embodied in the production, transportation, and combustion of different fuels for use in both current and potentially future scenarios of marine decarbonisation. And part of that involved some contact with individuals from Port London Authority, including specifically around the viability of LNG bunkering. So there has some contact with some of the organisations that are involved here. And I'm very looking forward to this panel. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And last but not least, to introduce themselves, I'll hand over to Robert Edge, please.
Good morning, everybody. I work for the Haven Gateway Partnership, which is a public-private sector partnership covering North Essex and South Suffolk. One of our private sector members is actually Huddersfield Ports. Mark's on the panel. But what we've got to launch is that we have a couple of grant programs, one of which is a grant aimed at SMEs in the transport and logistics arena called TAIL, which is a match-funded grant aimed at maximising the use of vehicle and logistics-related information, capturing it and structuring it in such a way that you can use it for making sensible decisions in management. And we've awarded grants for things like vehicle routing, carbon capture calculation, carbon calculation, so that companies can actually, evidence to their customers what their strategy is. As earlier speakers have mentioned, if you can't measure it, you can't really develop a strategy to reduce it. And the other project we offer grants with is a program called iConstruct, which, although there is a separate panel discussion taking place later on construction, logistics is a very important part of getting materials to a construction site. And we've worked with a number of companies involved in the construction logistics sector, both in terms of delivering products to site and also with efficiencies of removing waste products and the circular economy. So we've got two grant programs that we can work on, but we also lobby quite heavily on matters related to logistics. I think that's me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think we'll just kick off with the first question. So the Southeast is a global gateway by both land and sea, but how difficult is that clean growth challenge for the ports and for our airports? I know we don't have any airports on the panel, but specifically around ports, I imagine this conversation will be. Tanya, would you be able to maybe start us off with kind of how difficult is the challenge for you?
I think it varies in different parts of the solutions that we've obviously heard this morning about different things. So things like renewables are, as Mark mentioned earlier, quite a simple solution, relatively speaking, and quite possible in terms of decarbonising some of those operational processes. We mustn't forget also ports, particularly the east. We have fantastic highways to use low carbon transport, so we can use consolidation and distribute materials. And part of the Thames Freeport is looking at that sort of consolidation for light freight and some of those other sort of opportunities for other different types of businesses. And we have the opportunity for things like boat building to bring some of that new technologies, and that's, I think, where some of that's that issue or some of those challenges. We are a heavily populated area, so space for some of these technologies and some of these fuels are difficult to find in the places where they're going to be needed. So in terms of the Thames, I'll stick to the place I know best. You know, the space in the east for storage of some of these alternative fuels is there, but the demand is likely to be in the centre of London or further west. So how do we get that challenge of logistics? Yes, we can use the river, perfect. But that still means we've got some challenges in terms of that concern. Regulatory, we've got two main observers in terms of the MCA and Maritime Coast Guard Agency on the water, but also the HSE on land, and the two working together is going to be key to making some of these things possible. We're also quite a regulated industry, so there's things like port safety codes and things that we need to consider as we make some of those changes. And so close working relationships with the government organisations that oversight some of that work and understand some of those barriers for the ports to facilitate some of that clean growth is going to be really key.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, would you like to comment on that, on the kind of difficulties for the challenge for the ports?
Well, I think it's an essential. So as Jonathan Porritt said in the outset, it's an essential that we move on this decarbonisation journey. It's how do we move that at pace? I think it's probably more of the challenge. Within our ports in the UK, we are already doing a number of activities around electrification of our equipment. The modal shift from road to rail is also helpful, and in terms of Felixstowe, we're talking about close to 30% of all cargo is moved by rail inland, which is helpful from that perspective. The move towards unaccompanied freight is also a way that is assisting with that, as opposed to driving long distances and using the advantage of unaccompanied freight, whether that be containers or unaccompanied trailers, I think is helpful. So if we talk about the basics, that's there. In terms of the move to more newer technologies, I did see a comment in the chat earlier by Trevor Scott around commercial vehicles. There is a move to EVs, but for the larger vehicles, the larger commercial vehicles, it's not necessarily the most ideal technology because of the weight limits, etc. As it happens, Hutchison will be procuring some electric tugs, vehicles to move around the port, and they will be coming into our fleet to help that decarbonisation journey. But I think the ultimate roadmap is probably getting more towards the use of green hydrogen in that aspect, and probably there is a roadmap there in terms of potentially use of hybrid technology in order to get eventually to more green fuels from that perspective. And then I think in terms of the other barriers, let's call it, I'm thinking of Jonathan's third point around de-risking. I recently attended a global offshore wind conference in London, fascinating conference. But the two themes that I came away with was the need for scalability and to reduce the logistics costs of offshore wind. And with our facility at Harwich, we're really ideally located to do that. But the other theme that came up through very clear was the need for anticipatory investment to be made, and investments in providing a footprint to meet that scale is a cost. And is there clever funding opportunities out there in order to enable that to unlock and to create that anticipatory investment, public-private sector partnerships, etc., to make that happen? So from our perspective, we're on the journey. It's an exciting journey to be part of. There are things that we are doing already, more to come, but probably for me, it's more around the technology is not quite there yet from a commercial vehicle point of view. So there's a lag in there that needs to be brought forward. And then from an anticipatory investment, I think working with the LEPs, working with government, working with private partners to boost that anticipatory investment is what's required.
Thank you. Just to pass over to if either Robert or Connor would like to come in.
Oh, sorry, go on, Connor.
No,
sorry.
Please, Robert, after you.
I think one of the big challenges with decarbonisation, particularly, is with regard to hydrogen. I realise Jonathan was a little bit dismissive of it, but we've got some particular challenges with batteries. I mean, a typical container train, which needs to tow 50, 60 containers long distances inland, often over 100 miles, needs 3,200 horsepower, and trying to get that with electricity. National Grid has actually said the cross-country route direct to the north and the Midlands from Felixstowe and Harwich, for example, is not going to be viable for electrification, which means any increase in container trains currently still needs to go into London and then out of London again, using these alternative haulage just to get to Ipswich, where the electrified lane starts. So there is, I see, opportunities for innovation in alternative vectors. We've recently had a dialogue with a potential investor at Freeport East, who's actually looking at converting, going back to steam, would you believe, but actually using hydrogen as a power source to run a steam turbine of a modified Class 66 workhorse freight railway engine.
Connor?
Sorry, I'm still, I'm just getting over the hydrogen-powered steam engine mission. Just to add, I suppose, whilst I haven't necessarily worked directly in ports, but from speaking to, particularly with logistic managers and port managers in the previous incarnation, one of the things that I think is very, very evident is that the capacity for ports to decarbonize and play a role in decarbonisation, an individual port, is very challenging. They are very much dependent on the wider system of both infrastructure and logistic flows that support them. So, for example, in terms of facilitating decarbonisation whilst of the actual fleet itself, one of the pathways that people are increasingly aware of is facilitating slow steaming or reduced speed of ships, which significantly reduces the power demand. But that requires a lot of cooperation with a number of ports along the routes that they serve in order to allow the entire trip to be properly scheduled. And equally, things like logistic costs in terms of, or infrastructural costs in terms of facilities for fuel storage or transfer. Very often there is a barriers onto who has ownership of most of the costs associated with the infrastructural investment required to facilitate decarbonization or step changes in either technologies or fuel supplies. So an individual port has very, limited is the wrong word, but faces a lot of struggles in terms of what they can, within their gift individually, but collectively, if you look at, let's say, the 10 biggest ports in the UK, the scope, their overall scope of the amount of cargo and trade that they facilitate. So the combined, let's say, lobbying power, for want of a much better word, of the larger port, not decrying the importance of cumulative with the smaller ports either, but just in terms of scale involved of the extent to which trade is supported by large ports collectively, that's a significant lobbying power for additional support and funding for things like infrastructure, additional grid investments that can help facilitate and enable these kind of transitions, which are very, very difficult for an individual port as an actor in isolation.
I think if I remain with you a minute, Connor, there's something which, I mean, it's very high interest to Transport for the South East as well, and it's about how it's about influencing national policy. So, for example, the import and export of goods depends as much on the first mile, last mile as on the passage of goods through ports and airports. But where should partners in the South East be looking to influence wider national policy to drive that clean growth through the logistics sector? Like, we all kind of have established there's quite a big issue with the carbon contribution from the logistics sector, ports, airports. It's necessary. The issue is the technology is kind of not quite where we need it to be. It's a real headache for many people, I'm sure. But how do we kind of influence to try and get a bit more into the national policy for this?
Well, I mean, firstly, I think one of the really important elements is not just necessarily lobbying for generalized improvement, but actually, point towards particular pathways that you can identify as being particularly compatible with your individual business needs and requirements. So the point on scalability of green hydrogen is really important. One of the we look at various scenarios of decarbonisation for many sectors, including the shipping and ports. Hydrogen is fantastic, but it requires a lot of energy to produce, and because of the storage issues, it has to be liquefied, which is very energy intensive. So instead of trying to lobby just for green growth in general is fine, but if you can identify, or if you can propose specific pathways that you can clearly make a business case that are in the short term compatible with your operations, I think that is very important, instead of trying to lobby in almost without a clear target or without some solution in mind. So I think that what's really important is trying to identify, to the best of our knowledge, of the technologies or the pathways that we can identify in the short term, what are most compatible with our current and future needs, and what are the potential barriers to try to implementing them. And of course, it won't be one solution. It's not, there's no silver bullets out there. There are quite a few bronze bullets, and the solutions for this very complex sector will be multivarious and manifold. So trying to effectively lobby for a single solution isn't going to, the sector will be facilitated by decarbonisation of the wider grid. That's a help. It won't solve the problem on its own, but that process will enable and support, let's say, the increased electrification of port activities as well. So there's all number of different actors involved, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's really complicated for this sector in particular.
Thank you. Is there anybody else on the panel who would like to share their thoughts on that? I was thinking particularly, Mark, it might be interesting with the setting up of the free ports and how obviously connected you are with government on that basis. And obviously you said that you're going to be from the start, it's got a net zero focus. And how have you kind of found that with working with government on the free port?
Yeah, well, I mean, the aims of the free ports are threefold, for those of you not aware. One is to boost global trade. The second is creating jobs, skills, levelling up, particularly around coastal regions within our region. And third is around creating a hotbeds of innovation. But there's an overall wrapper of a net zero agenda there within that. And when we're putting our business cases to government, this is very key that we bring those points across in terms of our offering and the types of tenants and businesses and inward investors that are going to work within our Freeport. I mean, one of the advantages of Freeport East in particular is that combination of it being a deep sea container terminal in terms of Felixstowe, but then also having ro-ro services out of Felixstowe and Harwich that regularly go back to continental Europe. So there is an opportunity there from an efficiency saving for businesses to set up within the Freeport to import their components, do some wonderful added value, innovative activities within the Freeport, and then use the Freeport East as a springboard into Europe. And that saves all that logistics costs of taking it inland, all the empty mileage that potentially there might be in terms of that process. So in terms of some basics, without thinking about the actual clean energy piece, but more on the efficiency, it's a very efficient way of producing goods, adding value to goods and exporting to businesses around the world. I think logistics in general, the supply chains are well monitored and well managed across the piece, but as Carl says, there are many actors involved in that, and sometimes that collaboration, that communication is not always as you would want it to be. So removing waste from supply chains, I think, is the biggest opportunity. But within ports itself and within the Freeport, I think the creation of clean energy and also then the distribution of that clean energy, I think that's where Freeports and Freeport East in particular can play a big role within our region.
Could I perhaps add to what Mark said in terms of that collaboration? I think and I think someone on the comments has mentioned it. It's not just it's finding the right opportunities. So the free ports are a really good point to come and speak to government about those opportunities and have that conversation about the economics and the benefit to local communities. But the government is also starting to put, in some cases, different frameworks for some of those conversations. So in maritime sense, there's a complete shift in how the MCA is looking at it in terms of technology going into vessels, and they have a completely non-regulatory function where those ports can go and speak to, whether it's our harbour vessels or vessels we're likely to facilitate on our waterways, or even technology providers themselves can speak to them before it becomes a regulatory function of the licensing of a vessel. But similarly, there's an international look to everything that port does. We're massively part of a global supply chain, and there are so many things happening on that platform. And where there are groups that we have benefited as the PLA, the air quality work we've done, the evidence-based approach we took, came from learning from international ports and harbours around the world, principally America, but also in our nearest neighbours in North Europe. And there are differences, of course, in terms of the structural policy and the government frameworks, but there are some real opportunities to learn from those differences, how it could work in the UK, and we being the closest in terms of that sort of proximity, it's really useful to recognise that there is a lot of effort on the other side of the North Sea and the Channel that actually we can benefit from, rather than starting from the point of scratch, start again. Yes, okay, there's different regulations and so on, even more so now, but there are things that we can learn from, and there are pieces of work going on internationally around things like clean fuels and provision that effectively UK ports will benefit from, because we won't need to start that question right from scratch.
I think it would be really interesting. There's a few questions in the comments just around what is kind of happening to help reduce. It's mainly movements of HGVs, for example, of how you're getting them from ports to the customer, and so it'd be really interesting if you could kind of say some of the stuff that you might be looking at within your port to kind of help. It's that, as someone said earlier, a lot of this is not necessarily because the technology isn't quite where we need it to be, and it's around efficiencies and making better, more efficient choices, and enabling those. So it'd be really good to hear your thoughts on that, and also from Robert, because I know that there's a lot of work happening there with the efficiencies in the logistics sector. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that, would be really helpful.
I can very briefly cover some of the things that the PLA has done. So a lot of what we as an organisation have been doing, but with partners in the Freeport or as terminals up and down the river, is looking at that consolidation, and actually the last mile context is a really important one, because it's not just heavy goods vehicles, it's this light goods as well, where they're increasing their amount of emissions. Is actually looking at whether it needs to go on straight onto a lorry, or whether it can go by river to closer to its end destination, and reducing the handling in doing so. So some of this work we're looking at the moment is really working out whether we can use some of those infrastructure that were made perhaps for passengers to also do light freight, so that that lorry that then has to be transferred into the light goods vehicle and then handed into a local individual, you end up putting it on a barge or into a vessel that's already running that route. And it's handed straight into an e-cargo bike, or those sorts of vehicles instead. So your efficiency is actually, because of those distances, potentially switching straight into low emission technology straight away.
Thank you. Robert, would you like to just comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can see one of the trends, certainly for decarbonisation of the last mile. I mean, a good example is the DPD depot in Mayfair. Now, you wouldn't actually think that DPD would build a depot in Mayfair. It's not a large depot. It's only about 5,000-6,000 square feet. And the reason being is it actually gets electric vans to feed in deliveries for recipients in hedge funds and various other people doing things in Mayfair, very rich people. And as you say, it's e-cargo bikes and ladies and gentlemen walking around on foot doing deliveries to within that area. But I certainly see increasingly what we're finding is there's a trend. I think there's an experiment going on, I think, in Teesside at the moment. Sorry, it's, other free ports are available, and we've got two of them on the thing here, where they are actually looking at using passenger tray or two passenger carriages, where last mile deliveries are actually already in racks, which you can actually roll off the passenger train and directly into transit vans to delivery, you know, possibly for small retailers and all that sort of things. And that's actually an efficient way of actually using the infrastructure you've already got at a time, you know, which is possibly more perhaps early in the morning or late at night when passenger trains aren't used on that facility. So I think certainly with the rail enabled infrastructure that we've got here, I know also the Kent Tram project, the Kent Essex Tram folk are also looking at using the trams potentially on the same, obviously once they get the thing built, using the same module where, you know, last mile deliverers will actually take their, you know, take a trolley off the tram for their local last mile deliveries, you know, something on the lines of a Hermes package.
Now, we only have a minute and a half left, so it's gone very quickly. Are there any last kind of comments from anybody before I kind of have to close the session? I don't know if Connor and Mark, if either of you wanted to have a quick last couple of sentences.
Yeah, I think one from my side, just a quick one, and you know, I'm not quite sure who's in the audience out there, but there's clearly people who are interested in the net zero agenda and can maybe advance that further forward. I think from a Freeport East perspective and also from a Hutchison Ports perspective, you know, Hutchison Ports are a global investor and successful terminal operator. We're not necessarily an R&D company, but as a sandpit, there's no bigger sandpit than maybe the Port Felixstowe and Harwich in order to trial some of these new technologies. And the Freeport is not just about big business, it's about creating opportunities for SMEs as well, in terms of hitting those marks around global trade, levelling up agenda and innovation. And if there are people out there that can assist with that decarbonisation journey, take advantage of what we're looking to try to build, particularly in Harwich in terms of an offshore wind manufacturing hub and green energy hub, then yeah, pass on my contact details. Would be pleased to work with them.
Okay, we're going to be immediately automatically put back in the session now. So thank you for everyone for joining us. We've got 10 seconds. So thank you for your questions, everyone. And thank you to panelists for joining us today. And it's been really insightful. I think you're going to be asked a poll when we go back. So